It's true that when Tolkien began the fantasy genre with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, books in general were just written in a more high-minded way back then. People used bigger vocabularies to a certain extent in their day-to-day speech. That's definitely overdone and not historically accurate to the extent that people think it is, at least among all social classes. But it's true that back then, literature in general was a lot more erudite. But despite the fact that pretty much every single other genre has thrown all of their erudition out the nearest window, there's not much erudition, I can tell you that much, in most of the latest romance novels, thrillers, etc. Fantasy novels, and to an extent sci-fi novels, but it's especially fantasy novels that are guilty of this, they seem to cling a bit more strongly to that fancier kind of speech. I'm currently reading a novel, The Three Bastards by Jonathan French, and it's a reasonably well-written novel. The kind of writing that you'd expect from fantasy, very long, very detailed, very into the world building, and I'm liking it enough, but the thing is, it's about half-orc barbarian hog riders who, have a bunch of weapons, and they're violent, and they're drunk, and they have body, and have lots of sex, and they're just a bunch of rowdy, they're thugs, basically. I'm basically reading a book about gangsters who overthrow a kingdom. It's a whole thing. But they talk like scholars. Even back, 500 years ago, people in that social class, from that kind of lifestyle, did not talk like this. They didn't know all these big words. Almost nobody from that era talked like that except the aristocracy, and they were just trying to show off. If you're just a regular person, you're not going to... For instance, he uses the word earnest instead of honest. Being earnest, blah, blah, blah. Shut up. People even said honest back then. That's not how people talk. It's trying to sound fantasy-ish, if you catch my drift. And people say it wouldn't make sense for the characters to use quote-unquote anachronistic speech, to say things that sound like our modern-day, slang that you'd hear on a street just walking around in the real world today. If people say gotta, gonna, huh, what's, if they have contractions, ew, modern people use contractions, we don't have those in our fantasy novels, then it just wouldn't make sense. Because these are people in an older era, these are people with less technology and stuff, so therefore they're not going to use modern words. But the thing is, these people aren't from an older era. At least not an older era of our world. Unless you are writing a fantasy that's set in an older era of our world, in which case I guess this doesn't really apply to you. But in fantasy novels set in alternate universes, which is the majority of them, they're not set in our world at all. So theoretically, they wouldn't be using any of our speech, which includes our speech from hundreds of years ago. Assuming that the British Empire did not go and cross dimensions and conquer this fantasy universe hundreds of years ago, then they're not going to use, for instance, English speech from hundreds of years ago. The exact same way that they're not going to be using modern-day English speech. However, this gives you a little bit of a problem, because most of your readers don't speak whatever made-up fantasy languages people speak in your world. So you have two options. You can either force all of your readers to take a course in Klingon, or you can write your book in English. However, since the characters, theoretically, aren't speaking in English, that means that your book is a translation. This is a concept that I believe Tolkien himself spoke of, and Brandon Sanderson touched on in his creative writing course that he teaches at Brigham Young University, I believe it is. Essentially, the text is being translated, not literally being translated, but in universe, so to speak. The canon is that it is being translated from that fantasy language into English, or whichever language that your novel is in. So as long as you're translating it into a language which your audience understands, and I hope you are, then why on earth are you going to translate it into English from hundreds of years ago rather than into English from this day? Because if you're going to make everybody talk like a scholar from hundreds of years ago, and that's what so many authors in fantasy do, and it bugs me to no end, you would make everybody a nerd. But people don't all talk the same way, irrespective of social class and things like that. People use big words from certain social classes. People from other social classes don't. And anachronistic speech is just going to make more sense to your audience. It's just easier to follow and harder to get bogged down in. But it's not as much like how they'd be talking in that world, except it is. Yeah, that world was pre-industrial, but that doesn't mean that those people are going to be talking in the exact same words as people did in pre-industrial times in this world. The modern day words that we have are equivalents, in a lot of cases, to other words that we had in pre-industrial times. They had colloquialisms back then. They've had colloquialisms throughout the entire history of humanity. So when you're taking colloquialisms in that fantasy language, you can either translate them into a colloquialism from 400 years ago, or into some erudite word that scholars, even in the modern era, use, and for some reason turn every single character into a college professor in a way that doesn't make any sense. Or you can just say gotta, gonna, ain't. Regular words. At the end of the day, the point that I want to make is that using erudite terms or really old-timey terms for your translation, so to speak, for the fantasy speech that's happening in your story is not even one iota more realistic than using modern-day speech. And in many cases, it can be less realistic when you make people talk in ways that just don't match their character. And it can just make things harder to say. The book I'm reading, the descriptions take a long time to read because it's big words and it's long sentences and it sounds very fancy and the author gains nothing from it. It's my least favorite part of the book.